The scene required her to cry. August 14th, 1960. The set of The Truth, a film about a woman on trial for murder, defending her right to exist on her own terms. The director, Henri-Georges Clouzot, was known for pushing actors to their breaking points to capture authentic emotion. He didn't need to push Brigitte. She was already broken. Action. Brigitte stood in the mock courtroom, surrounded by actors playing judges and prosecutors, and began her monologue. Words about being trapped, about performing for survival, about losing yourself in the roles others demand you play. The tears came easily. Too easily. Halfway through the scene, something shifted. The words she was speaking, scripted, fictional, meant for a character, suddenly felt like her own confession, like someone had written her internal monologue and disguised it as dialogue. I'm not the person you think I am. I'm whoever you need me to be, and I don't know how to stop. The camera kept rolling. The crew kept watching, and Brigitte kept crying, the performance bleeding into reality until she couldn't tell where the character ended and she began. That was the moment. The moment she realized she wasn't acting anymore. She was surviving. Every smile, every pose, every word, all of it was performance designed to keep her safe, keep her working, keep her alive. Acting had stopped being her job. It had become her entire existence. The realization didn't come all at once. It had been building for years, accumulating in small moments that Brigitte had pushed aside because acknowledging them would have required confronting an unbearable truth. The first hint came in 1957, during a photo shoot for Paris Match. The photographer kept asking her to be more natural, to just relax and be yourself. Brigitte tried. She really did. But after 15 minutes of failing to produce whatever natural looked like, she'd finally snapped, I don't know what that means. Which self? I have 20 different versions depending on who's asking. The photographer had laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't joking. By 1957, Brigitte had already fractured into multiple performed versions of herself. There was Brigitte for directors, Brigitte for photographers, Brigitte for journalists, Brigitte for fans, Brigitte for lovers, Brigitte for friends. Each one carefully calibrated to give people what they wanted while protecting whatever was left of the real her. But maintaining all those versions was exhausting. And somewhere in the performance, the original, the authentic Brigitte had gotten lost. The second hint came during her marriage to Jacques Charrier in 1959. They were having dinner at home, a rare quiet evening without cameras or crowds. Jacques looked at her across the table and said, I miss you. Brigitte blinked, confused. I'm right here. No, you're not. You're performing being here. I can see you calculating every word, every expression, even alone with me. You're acting. She'd wanted to deny it, to insist she was being genuine, but she couldn't, because he was right. Even in her own home, with her own husband, Brigitte was performing, monitoring her words, controlling her expressions, playing the role of wife, the same way she played roles on screen. She'd forgotten how to just exist without an audience, even an audience of one. Jacques had tried to reach the real her, had begged her to drop the performance, to be vulnerable, to be present. But by then, Brigitte didn't know how. The performance had become involuntary, automatic, a survival mechanism she couldn't turn off. The third hint, the one that should have been impossible to ignore, came during her first suicide attempt in September 1960. She'd taken the pills methodically, counted them out, written a brief note, laid down to die. And even then, even in what should have been her most private, most authentic moment, part of her brain was thinking, if they find me like this, the photos will be everywhere. I should fix my hair, position myself better. She was directing her own death scene. That's when the horror truly set in. Even dying, she was performing. Even ending her life, she was thinking about how it would look to others. There was no escape from the performance. Not in sleep, not in solitude, not even in death. Acting had stopped being something she did. It had become something she was. But the full realization, the complete, devastating understanding, came during that scene in The Truth. When Brigitte spoke those lines about being trapped in performance, about losing herself in roles others demanded, something clicked. The words were scripted, but they were also true. Completely, horrifyingly true. She was standing in a fake courtroom, being filmed by cameras, performing lines written by someone else, surrounded by people being paid to watch her, and it was exactly the same as her real life. Her entire existence had become a performance. Every interaction was staged. Every emotion was calculated. Every moment was being observed and judged and documented. There was no difference between the set and her life. Both required her to be Brigitte Bardot. Both required constant performance. Both required her to suppress anything authentic in favor of what was expected. The scene in the film was about a woman defending her right to exist authentically, despite society's demands that she perform an acceptable version of femininity. And Brigitte was living that exact scenario. Except she'd lost. The performance had won. Cut. Clouseau approached her, concerned. Brigitte, that was intense. Are you all right? She looked at him with tears still streaming down her face. I don't know. I don't think so. Do you need a break? That's when she said it. Out loud. For the first time. I need to stop acting. Not just this scene. Everything. I need to stop performing every moment of my life, or I'm going to die. Clouseau thought she was having an emotional moment, triggered by the heavy material. He gave her 20 minutes to compose herself. But Brigitte wasn't having an emotional moment. She was having a clarity moment, a devastating crystal clear understanding of what her life had become. She sat in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at her was famous, recognizable to millions, desired, photographed, iconic, and completely unfamiliar. She didn't know this person. This Brigitte Bardot, who smiled on command, who embodied sexuality she didn't feel, who moved through the world in a constant state of performance. Somewhere beneath that face was the real her, the girl who'd wanted to be a ballet teacher, who loved animals more than people, who cried during thunderstorms, who laughed at stupid jokes. But that girl had been buried so deep under layers of performance that Brigitte didn't know how to reach her anymore. Every day for the past 4 years had been about survival, about giving people what they wanted so they wouldn't destroy her, about controlling her image so tightly that nothing authentic could slip through. And the survival strategy had worked. She was the most famous actress in the world, but she'd survived at the cost of actually living. She'd protected herself by becoming someone else entirely. The pattern was everywhere. Once she started looking, interviews where she gave the answers, journalists wanted instead of the truth, relationships where she performed the role of lover instead of actually connecting, friendships where she calculated every word to avoid vulnerability, photo shoots where she embodied a sexuality she'd stopped feeling years ago. Even alone, she was performing, because the performance had become her default mode. A diary entry from that night, August 14th, 1960, today I realized, I'm not an actress who has a life outside of acting. I'm a full-time performer who happens to also work in films. There's no off switch, no private self, just endless performance. I cry on command. I smile on command. I pose on command. I exist on command. And I don't know who I'd be if I stopped taking commands. That's the terrifying part. The performance has consumed so much of me that I'm not sure there's anything left underneath. The understanding changed how Brigitte saw everything that had happened to her. The exploitation by Vadim? Not just professional manipulation. It was training her to perform constantly, to suppress her authentic self in favor of a marketable product. The eating disorder? Not just about control. It was her body's rebellion against the constant performance, the only form of authenticity available when everything else was scripted. The suicide attempts. Not just depression. They were desperate attempts to escape a life that had become entirely performance with no room for actual existence. Every symptom, every breakdown, every crisis, all of it was her real self trying to break through the performance. And every time, the industry had medicated her, covered it up, and sent her back to performing. The crew noticed the change immediately. After that scene in The Truth, Brigitte was different. Harder to direct, less compliant, more likely to question everything. Why does she smile here? What's her motivation for this gesture? I don't think my character would do that. Closot grew frustrated. You've never asked these questions before. What changed? Brigitte met his eyes. I'm trying to figure out the difference between performing and existing, and I don't want to confuse them anymore. The director had no idea what she meant, but Brigitte did. She was trying to reclaim the distinction between acting, something she did for work, and being something that should have been automatic but had become impossible. The realization led directly to her retirement decision 3 years later. Because once Brigitte understood that her entire life had become performance, she had two choices: continue performing until there was nothing left of her at all, or stop completely, risk everything to find out if there was still a real person underneath. She chose the latter, because survival without living wasn't really survival at all. In her retirement announcement in 1963, she tried to explain, "I'm not leaving because I don't love acting. I'm leaving because I don't know where acting stops and my life begins anymore. And I need to find out if I'm still a person or if I've become nothing but a performance." The journalists didn't understand. They thought she was being dramatic, artistic, difficult. They didn't understand she was being literal. She genuinely didn't know if there was a real Brigitte left underneath all the performed versions. The years after retirement were about excavation. Slowly, painfully, Brigitte had to strip away the performed layers and search for whatever authentic self remained. It was harder than she'd imagined, because the performance had become so habitual that even alone, she'd catch herself posing, monitoring her expressions, calculating how actions would look to an invisible audience. A therapist she saw in 1965 noted, "Patient describes feeling like she's constantly on stage, even in private. Struggles to identify authentic emotions versus performed emotions. Asks repeatedly, how do I know if I'm really feeling this or just acting like I am? Progress will be slow." The line between performance and reality had been so thoroughly erased that rebuilding it required years of conscious effort. The breakthrough came in 1967. During a moment so mundane it almost seemed meaningless. Brigitte was alone in her Saint-Tropez villa, feeding a stray dog she'd adopted. The dog looked up at her with complete trust, tail wagging, and Brigitte laughed. A real, spontaneous, uncontrolled laugh. Then she froze, because she'd just had an authentic emotional response without calculating it first, without performing it, without controlling it. She sat on the floor and cried. Not performed crying. Real crying. Messy and loud, and completely uncontrolled. For the first time, in over a decade, she'd existed without performing, and it felt like being born. From that moment, she started cataloging genuine experiences, moments where she responded authentically instead of performing. Crying at a sad movie, not because she should, but because she actually felt moved. Getting angry at something unfair. Not controlled anger, but real rage. Feeling joy at sunrise. Not photogenic appreciation, but genuine wonder. Small moments. But each one was evidence that underneath the performance, there was still a real person. By the 1970s, Brigitte had largely reclaimed the distinction between performing and existing. She could act when she chose to, in advocacy work, in rare public appearances, but it was a choice, a tool she used consciously, rather than an involuntary state. She existed inconstantly. The difference was profound. A journalist who interviewed her in 1975 noted she was shockingly real. No performance, no calculation, just present. It was jarring, after years of watching her be so controlled, but also beautiful, like meeting someone for the first time, even though I'd known her for decades. The performance had been survival, but authentic existence was living. In a 1989 interview, Brigitte was asked about that moment on the set of The Truth, when she'd realized she wasn't acting anymore. Do you remember the exact moment you understood? Vividly. I was speaking lines about being trapped in performance, and I realized the lines were my confession. I wasn't playing a character. I was describing my life. How did that change you? It forced me to choose, keep performing until there was nothing left of me, or stop and risk finding out I'd already disappeared. I chose to stop, and I found out I was still there. Barely, but there. Do you still struggle with it? The urge to perform? She smiled. Every day. The performance was survival for so long that it's still my default. But now I can catch myself. I can choose to be present instead of performed. That's the difference between surviving and living. And which are you doing now? Living. Finally. It took me 40 years, but I'm finally living. The moment Brigitte Bardot realized she wasn't acting anymore, she was surviving, was the beginning of her escape. Because you can't change what you don't acknowledge. And she'd spent years refusing to acknowledge that her entire existence had become performance. The cameras were always rolling. The audience was always watching. The role was always demanding she suppress anything authentic in favor of what was expected. Acting had metastasized from her profession into her entire mode of being, and the only cure was to stop. Completely. Risk everything to find out if there was still a real person underneath. That scene in The Truth, where she spoke scripted lines about being trapped in performance, was the moment the character's truth became indistinguishable from her own. And in that moment of devastating clarity, Brigitte understood she wasn't acting her way through a scene, she was acting her way through her life. Every smile was performance. Every word was calculated. Every gesture was controlled, not because she wanted to perform, but because she'd forgotten how to do anything else. Survival had required constant performance, and the performance had consumed her. But here's the redemptive truth. Realizing you're performing is the first step towards stopping. Brigitte spent the rest of her life reclaiming authentic existence, learning to distinguish between acting and being, choosing presence over performance. It wasn't easy. The habits were deeply ingrained, but she did it. The woman who'd been nothing but performance eventually learned how to simply be, and in learning that distinction between surviving through performance and living through authenticity, she finally escaped the prison fame had built. The cameras stopped rolling. The audience left. The performance ended. And for the first time in decades, Brigitte Bardot just existed. Not as an actress, not as a sex symbol, not as a performance, just as herself. Imperfect. Real. Finally. Mercifully. Alive.